Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Steele, and I'm chairman of the Aspen Institute, and I'm especially delighted to welcome you, as well as our listening audience, on Aspen Public Radio and our viewers on Grassroots TV. I also want to take a moment to thank Tom and Bonnie McCloskey and their family for their generous support of this program and some other terrific evenings during the course of the summer. Now, it's my great privilege to introduce our distinguished guest. First, the moderator of this evening's conversation, our very own Aspen Institute's Walter Isaacson, who's the president and CEO of our organization. And tonight's special guest, Richard Haass. Richard has been a key presidential advisor on a host of foreign policy matters and, since 2003, has served as the president of the Venerable Council on Foreign Relations. Richard's also here with us as a member of the Institute's Aspen Strategy Group, a distinguished cadre of foreign policy experts and government officials, which will be meeting next week. And their topic this year, and every year they take a specific challenge they try to focus on, and this year's topic is the global economic crisis and potential implications for foreign policy and national security. Richard's had a long and distinguished career as an expert on national security affairs and has been on the strategic front line of both wars in Iraq, and therefore has a unique perspective to share with us this evening. He'll sign copies of his newest book, War of Necessity, War of Choice, in the lobby following this event. It's our great fortune to have Richard Haass with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming him to the Aspen Institute. Thank you.
Thanks for being back, Richard. Good to have you. You served both Presidents George Bush. Walk us through the walk-up to the first President Bush's Gulf War. What was it like when you had to walk in and talk to them about the fact that they needed to go to war?
Well, let's set the stage. We're talking about August of 1990. And just to give you an idea, this was around 9 months after the Berlin Wall came down, not even, which, by the way, we're about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this year, 11/9, as opposed to 9/11. And it was so relatively early in his presidency, 18 months into his presidency. You'd had about 2 weeks of buildup of Iraqi forces on the border in Kuwait. And this was a part of the world we really weren't looking for anything much to happen, simply because virtually the entire Reagan presidency paralleled the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq War. And the strategic assumption, and as we'll come back to, I expect tonight, assumptions can be dangerous things. The assumption was that the protagonists, Iran and Iraq, were too exhausted and depleted to do anything new. So we weren't particularly looking for or expecting trouble. Nevertheless, the Iraqis built up forces for about 2 weeks, from mid-July to the end of July of 1990, against the Kuwaiti border. And we thought it was a game of bluff, gunboat diplomacy, that they had been cranky about the Kuwaitis overproducing oil, which was putting downward pressure on oil prices. Saddam Hussein wanted oil prices to rise because he needed money desperately to fund his ambitions. So we didn't take it seriously until the last moment, when too many things were happening that would only happen if it weren't a bluff. And so we had an all-day meeting. I was the senior person from the White House at the meeting, and I was deputized basically to go back and speak to Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, and the President, to make a last-ditch effort to try to dissuade Saddam Hussein from doing this. So I called Brent, explained what happened. He said, come right over. He had called the President, and the President said, well, come see me. It was a slightly awkward moment because the President was basically naked, prone on a table in the White House infirmary, the sick bay, getting a massage.
From hitting golf balls.
From hitting golf balls, yeah. Something, history unfolds in mysterious ways.
It's
yes.
wonderful how things are kind of personal. You think they're these grand forces. Yeah.
Well, policy is made by people,
yeah.
Shockingly enough. So we were literally having a conversation about, do we try to go to the Iraqis in Washington, or do we try to go to the Iraqis through our embassy in Baghdad? Because at the end of the day, high policy, and we have Madeleine Albright here and others, you've also just got to make it real. You got to figure out how to make it happen. And the Iraqi ambassador in Washington was a loose cannon. So we knew that wouldn't be a very helpful thing. So we figured we'd make a last-ditch effort to go to Saddam himself, because there would be no deputy. I mean, in Baghdad, the phrase, shoot the messenger, is not just a metaphor, it's real. So no one was going to go into Saddam Hussein and deliver. So we thought we'd try to get him. And literally, as we were figuring out how to do this, the phone rang. And it was Bob Kimmett on the line. Bob, at this point, was the acting secretary, with the news that our embassy in Kuwait.
He was Deputy Secretary of State.
He was undersecretary. He was undersecretary.
But acting Secretary of State.
Larry Biegelberger and Jim Baker were both off, and saying our embassy in Kuwait is reporting shots in the street. So it was too late to try to head something off. Just 30 more seconds. I just met with some students, and one of them asked me, if you've been able to get through to Saddam Hussein, do you think it would have essentially stopped things? And my answer is no. I'm not sure he would have taken the call, but even if he had, for a guy who wasn't going to be dissuaded by 500,000 American soldiers, by a dozen UN Security Council resolutions and the rest, to me it was unlikely that a single phone call was going to dissuade him.
And walk us up to what happened when we launched the Iraq War under the younger George Bush. You were also part of that process. It was much different.
Much different, other than the fact that you had a President Bush, a Saddam Hussein, and a country called Iraq. Really isn't much in the way of similarity. The second time around, in this case, 2002, 2003, I wasn't working at the White House. Now I was working at the State Department for Colin Powell. And in the spring of 2002, some of the people who worked for me started coming back and saying, Richard, something's going on here. All the people who work for Dick Cheney and Condi Rice and Don Rumsfeld who want to go to war with Iraq, they're too happy. They're all beginning to act cocky. Something's going on. So I had about once a month, I had a meeting with Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Council, National Security Advisor. It was just the two of us. And so I raised the issue. I said, we're beginning to pick up signals that you're thinking of going to war against Iraq, you and the president. I really don't think that's a good idea. Let me tell you why. And she said, Richard, save your breath, hold your breath. The president's already made up his mind. And this is early July of 2002, 9 months before the war actually began.
And before all that UN diplomacy.
Before that, and before there had even been a meeting in the administration to formally weigh the pros and cons of whether to go to war against Iraq. So I remember scrambling back to the State Department, in this case, basically going down the same street in the opposite direction that it had taken place a dozen years before, and saying I needed to see Colin Powell. Got in to see Colin right away and said, you won't believe this conversation. He said, you must have misunderstood. Couldn't be. He said, let me run a few trap lines. I'll find out. And sure enough, it was true. And that by the time, about a month later, early August, that Colin had dinner with the president, this is now the 43rd president, George W. Bush, and Condoleezza Rice up in the residence, the decision had the decision had already been made. And the real question was how to do it, not whether to do it. Whether to go, there are questions like using Congress, using the United Nations. And secondly, what are important but still second-order questions.
I know you were not in favor of it, so you can't say, but why did George Bush decide that early to go against Iraq?
My own take on it, and this is my own take, just that, a couple of reasons. And decisions in governments are rarely just made for one reason, and this is no exception. A big part of it was after 9/11. There was a strong view in the administration. The United States needed to send a message to the world, to borrow a phrase actually from Mr. Nixon, a previous president, that we were not a pitiful, helpless giant. Mm-hmm. We wanted to send a message that we could be an agent of history and not simply a victim of history. That was the view of the president and his senior lieutenants. And Afghanistan, which you recall, the Taliban hosted al-Qaeda, and the United States ousted the Taliban in late 2001 after 9/11. That didn't scratch the itch. That didn't satisfy people. It wasn't seen as making a sufficient geopolitical statement to reverse the course of perceptions or history. People then turned to Iraq, not because Iraq was involved in 9/11, although many people tried to prove that it was, but it wasn't. But because they believed that Iraq had a strategic significance that Afghanistan would never have. Iraq is the one Arab country in some ways that has it all. If Iraq hadn't had such awful leadership, it really should have been the Middle Eastern tiger. Mm-hmm. It's got oil, it's got water, it's got a talented population, arable land, and so forth. So they thought Iraq would be significant. They thought Iraq was ripe for democracy. And they believed that as went Iraq would go the rest of the Middle East. They thought that Iraq...
You're talking about neoconservative thinkers, strategic thinkers in this case. Is
Yeah.
that Bush, too?
I think President Bush bought into it in a way that many of you would buy into it. If you had been promised something that would cost very little and would deliver tremendous results, you would go, hey, not bad. And that was essentially the way Iraq was teed up, that this was something that would be easy to do and would have strategic dividends that would be, to use the word, transformative. So if you're in President Bush's shoes, it was, in that sense, a very attractive option. And one other thing, to be fair, that after 9/11, there was precious little tolerance for anything else terrible that could go on, and the working assumption, and it was, I believe, near universally held, and I never heard anyone accepting himself or herself from it, that Iraq did possess chemical and biological weapons. So there was very little tolerance for what an Iraq with chemical and biological weapons might do in the post-9/11 world. So I think all of these things came together.
You mentioned a few moments ago that, sort of half-jokingly, that other than Saddam Hussein, a president named Bush, and a country named Iraq, they were totally different. But it does seem to me you were part of that same team. Cheney was part of that same team. Wolfowitz was part of both teams. Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld. It was pretty much the same cast of players. How did the relationship, Powell on the one side, Cheney, Rumsfeld on the other, you talked about a moment ago, personality actually plays a role. How did that play a role?
Well, in the first Bush administration, Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, you'll recall, was the odd man out. You had President Bush 41, who was a great believer in diplomacy, in moderate, almost a foreign policy traditionalist, you might say. You had Brent Scowcroft, who I believe...
He's gotten uninvited to the strategy group.
Sic transit gloria. Who I believe in some ways was the finest national security advisor we've ever had.
You've just gotten invited back. Yeah.
There we go. Life is good. And you had Jim Baker and someone else who believes sincerely in diplomacy, Bob Gates, who at that point was Brent Scowcroft's
so Gates
deputy.
actually is in both. In some
Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was a very like-minded group.
Like-minded meaning pragmatic, realist, traditionalist.
All of those things, believed in diplomacy, believed in collective action, put their emphasis on a school of thought about American foreign policy, that the principal, if you will, business of American foreign policy ought to be to shape the foreign policies of others, not to go about transforming the world, not to engineer other societies, but essentially to shape behavior. And Dick Cheney, who really wasn't that vocal during this earlier administration, to the extent he did harbor very different views, or Paul Wolfowitz, who was also in that administration, they were the minority. Switch gears 10, 12 years later for the 43rd president, it was Colin Powell who was the odd man out. And instead you had the 43rd president himself, George W. Bush, you had Dick Cheney now as vice president, you had Don Rumsfeld at defense. You basically had a silenced uniformed military. In my experience, the uniformed military is often far more cautious and moderate than their civilians.
Silence, meaning, as you say in your book, that Rumsfeld wouldn't let them.
Right. They basically lost their independent voice around the interagency.
Because of Rumsfeld.
Partially that, partially their own reticence at times, given their own culture and training. But the net result of this was an administration that had this bias far more towards doing more ambitious, if you will, approaches, but also it was a far less disciplined or rigorous administration in terms of how it made its foreign policy. So the first time around, it was just simply a more orderly process where the give and take was more structured. The second time around, again, it's quite stunning, and historians will probably scratch their heads about the lack of care, either about the basic decision to go to war, and an equal lack of care about preparations for the aftermath of the war, which obviously proved so expensive. And it was an informal system. And it was very much the preference of the second President Bush that things operate that way. He once said, I didn't need to have a formal meeting about Iraq. I knew where everyone stood. And he got the NSC, the National Security Council process he felt comfortable with. He got the one he wanted, but he didn't get the one he needed. And I've actually come to conclude that national security advisors, part of their job is to make their boss feel uncomfortable. And I don't believe that ever happened the second time around.
Yeah, and that was the difference between Brent and Brent's own protege, Dr. Rice, Condoleezza Rice. Somebody once asked me who is the best foreign policy president of my lifetime. And I thought for a while, and I said George Bush the elder, for having brought a soft landing to the Cold War and having 41 countries in a coalition or whatever it was for the Iraq War and doing that with clearly defined goals. Would you agree with that? And if so, what makes him that way?
Well, I think those were two of his biggest accomplishments. The peaceful end of the Cold War with a unified Germany within NATO. These were not, shall we say, inevitable or obvious things. The Gulf War success, which it was for the most part. The Madrid Peace Conference, which for the first time brought Israelis and Arabs face to face to discuss peace. It wasn't perfect. The Bosnia situation and all that was ragged, shall we say. But I think what was good is talented people, a very disciplined process, and my own biases will show here a sense of limits. I actually believe American foreign policy gets into trouble when we overreach. And we overreach, say, in Korea in the early 50s, not in resisting North Korean aggression, but in trying to reunify Korea by force, by going beyond the 38th parallel, which is what Truman and MacArthur did, and I think was Truman's biggest mistake as a foreign policy president. I think Bush 43 overreached in many ways with Iraq and some other things. What I think Bush 41 understood is that increasingly in this world, the United States, while it can lead, leadership suggests followership. You can't do things, for the most part, effectively alone. So he was very comfortable with working with others. He did set out goals that were clear but limited, surrounded himself with talented people, basically encouraged a disciplined process, but also an inclusive process. There wasn't a whole lot of leaking, because by and large, people got their days in court.
One of the great distinctions in American foreign policy is not hawk and dove, liberal, conservative, but realist versus the idealist. And I think you've pretty much described a realist mindset, which was a sense of limits. And your previous book was pretty much a case for that.
Which is not on sale here, is it?
There's 4 books right there. We can run downtown. Yeah, you got those. What's the name of the It seems to me that the two most different poles are the first Bush and the second Bush, because the second Bush is an idealist. He thinks he can transform the Middle East, and that's, I don't mean that in a bad way, that's a great thing to believe, but it's not a sense of limits of what you can do. And so it's like the two great contrasts.
I think it's the principal fault line of American foreign policy. I actually think there's unilateral, multilateral, isolationist, international. There's multiple fault lines. Yeah. But to me, the single biggest fault line is the one about what are we trying to achieve in the world. And is it this limited idea of shaping behavior, or is it a more ambitious idea of changing nature? Is it trying to change or alter the chemistry of other societies? Before people jump on me, the two are not mutually exclusive, and no administration is purely one or purely the other.
I will say, Madeleine Albright actually tried to weave together in very specific ways our interests and our ideals, which is hard to do.
Well, which you have to do, and it's the right thing to do, but like many things in life, it's a question of balance, and there are priorities. I mean, this is not just academic stuff. Right now, in your relationship with a China or a Russia, how much do you emphasize the things that give us real heartburn for real good reasons about their domestic nature, as opposed to saying, look, we don't like that, we're not going to make that a priority, but instead we're going to try to work with the Russians on Iran or the Chinese on North Korea. So there are real consequences of this. With the case of Iraq the second time around, did we have to go to war against Saddam Hussein? No. It was a war of choice. We had other options, and there were other considerations. But we chose to. So the policy of Bush 43, which in some ways is a kind of armed Wilsonianism, is to me a foreign policy that we can't sustain. I find it ironic, and we were talking about it this morning, some of us, that conservatives who are so cautious about what we can do within our society in terms of perfecting it, when it comes to international relations and foreign policy, suddenly get so ambitious.
Well, that's, I mean, let me interrupt there. That's one strain of neoconservatism. But to me, conservatism in foreign policy,
I agree.
yeah, it goes back to Metternich or Kissinger or Jim Baker or people who said, here are the limits. That's a true traditionalist conservative view,
I agree.
right?
I would agree.
I heard somebody say Kissinger, but I mean, Kissinger was a strong realist, whatever you thought of him.
Right. Again, it would be the emphasis would be on adjusting behaviors and not solving problems, not transforming countries in the short run, but essentially trying to gradually move relationships.
And has that historically been the conservative trend in foreign policy until the neocon movement changed that?
It's hard to, at some point, use words like conservative and the rest, because as you know better than anyone, the definitions change. They don't align themselves with party labels. But whatever you call it, liberal, conservative, I do think this is, in some ways intellectually, the richest fault line or spectrum. And again, like any spectrum, people, it's not, well, to use a football metaphor, you rarely end up in the end zones. And it's a question of which yard lines and what the balance is, what the priorities are. And it's not enough. I think it's too facile to say, well, American foreign policy needs to be realistic but also have principles. Well, sure. But when foreign policy gets interesting and where foreign policy gets strategic and where foreign policy gets hard is when you have to make those choices.
All right, let me bring you now to the present, since we've done too much history, perhaps. What do we do with Iran?
Well, let's put aside for a second what's going on domestically, because it's an important overlay and it's a complication. But Iran right now, as we sit here, its laboratories are working 24/7, as best we know. They are enriching uranium. To take one aspect of the Iranian challenge, which is the nuclear challenge. It's not the only aspect. There's terrorism. Iran is strategically, ironically enough, the greatest beneficiary of the Iraq War was Iran. And Iranian influence has mushroomed in the greater Middle East. But the nuclear challenge is the most acute challenge. And the real question is, what can we tolerate? I would say uranium enrichment up to a level, which the Iranians are doing now, which is a level that you would put into a nuclear reactor to produce electricity, is acceptable. I'd feel better about it if they had an operational nuclear reactor to put the uranium into. Clearly, they got the sequencing off, and it's only a matter of time. I believe this is acceptable. I also believe, if I were designing the American or international negotiating position, I would allow the Iranians some limited enrichment. And I basically would say the degree of enriching activity you would be allowed would be directly tied to the degree of intrusive inspections, which would give us confidence both about what you're doing and what you are not doing. So what I would try to do is put together a negotiated position with Russian and Chinese and Security Council backing that would essentially give the Iranians a choice. Either they could have a little bit of essentially a symbolic right to enrich, which they all say they want, whatever access to nuclear materials they would need for producing electricity, if in fact they want it. I would reduce all sorts of economic sanctions and so forth if they went down a responsible path. If not, I would certainly ratchet up the sanctions economically and conceivably beyond. The question of, I mean, ultimately the $64,000 question is whether we would contemplate the use of military force. And I think there one would simply have to be persuaded that you could really, by using military force, set back the Iranian program significantly. I am not persuaded that we or the Israelis could do that. You would also have to be confident that you could handle the retaliations and the market consequences, say, at the price of oil. And alternatively, you would have to look at your ability to manage a near-nuclear Iran. If Iran, for example, decided to move down the path closer to nuclear weapons, you'd have to decide, what could I do to deter certain things? What could I do to reassure some of its neighbors? Secretary of State Clinton got into a little bit of trouble, but essentially correctly forecasted some of the things we would do in terms of
the nuclear umbrella for the neighbors.
Umbrella assurances and so forth. So clearly the best option is a negotiated option that places a ceiling on the Iranian program that we can live with and we
But I
can
would
verify.
almost, with all due respect, call that a Council on Foreign Relations option, which is, it sounds really good amongst wood-paneled smart rooms, but I'm not sure it plays in Tehran or Qum.
Well, I'm not sure you can negotiate. I don't think it's fair to call it even an Aspen Institute option. It's the right first option because it's by far the best.
Yeah.
And before you could go to any other option, you would have to show that you had tried it in good faith, and that it had been found, if you will, beyond reach. In part, diplomacy is managing escalation, and part of managing escalation, either to a use of military force or an acceptance of an Iranian program, would be to demonstrate that you had made a good faith effort to persuade the Iranians. And there are ways I believe we could put significant pressure. I haven't given up on the negotiated outcome. But if you don't, yeah, then you're faced with two truly unattractive options. You know, and Yogi Berra once said, you know, the great strategist, when you reach a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah.
And that's where we could well be.
To get to Afghanistan, which you dealt with quite a bit when you were in government under second George Bush, if you were a true traditionalist, realist, conservative foreign policy scholar, it would seem you would say for 400 years people have kept going into the Hindu Kush and thought that they could change things, and it's a nightmare, and don't do it. You're overreaching just the minute you step in there. Does it make sense for us to be in Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan, the previous Bush, a little bit of history. The previous Bush got into Afghanistan, as you talked about after 9/11, as a war of necessity.
Right.
And the idea was to oust the Taliban, who had essentially facilitated al-Qaeda operations. After that, and I know this painfully well because I was chosen by this President Bush, the 43rd president, to coordinate our policy towards the future of Afghanistan. He would not go much beyond that. He would not get ambitious. He essentially, and the people around him, heeded what they perceived to be history's lesson, that outsiders should not get ambitious in Afghanistan. By the time Barack Obama then became president, he inherited a situation where Afghanistan was failing fast. The central government was losing control over increasing parts of the country, in part because of its own weaknesses, in part because of the sanctuary in western Pakistan. The Taliban was enjoying a resurgence, and they looked at three options, essentially. For some reason, governments only look at three options.
They always pick the middle, right?
Yeah, and they did in this case. One option was to essentially continue the Bush policy of ignoring what was happening in Afghanistan other than trying to go after al-Qaeda whenever it presented itself, a kind of minimalist option. They looked at a maximalist option, which would be far more than we're doing now in the numbers of troops, a real full-bore nation-building program. And what they came in the in-between option, which was some of it. And if you read President Obama's speech from, I believe, the end of March, I think it was the 27th, he talked about taking the war to the Taliban in the south and east of the country, essentially having the United States become a limited participant in Afghanistan's civil war, not as a permanent policy, but as a temporary one, to push the Taliban back and to try to use that time and space to build up the capacities of the Afghan police and military forces to improve governance in Afghanistan and so forth. So essentially the Afghan government could then carry on the war, potentially in an open-ended way, against the Taliban. I would say this is Barack Obama's first war of choice. And to describe something as a war of choice is not to criticize it, it's just to describe it. It meant he had other options. We don't necessarily have vital national interests here. But he decided that it was worth the investment. My own view is it's worth the try. I think it's uncertain whether it will succeed. And at some point, probably sooner rather than later, we're going to have to make a decision whether we double down on our investment, more troops, more effort, or we ease up on what we try to accomplish. And I believe that day is coming. My hunch is the administration will increase our investment in Afghanistan for the short haul. I think you're more likely to see more forces.
Is that a Biden-Holbrooke sort of approach? Or?
I don't know the internal. I think it's also a bit of strategic optimism coming out of the U.S. military about what they believe they can accomplish. The problem will be is, you know, the Taliban will hang back in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, and so you won't have a conclusive military victory. Instead, what you will have, though, is some time to build up the Afghan forces. And I think the biggest question is how well that takes. Is the building up of a central serious capacities, policing and military, for the central authority in Afghanistan, is that likely to be a successful or viable enterprise? I think
Has it ever been in history?
it is not. On the other hand, we've arguably gotten farther in Iraq than some people thought, and my hunch is people have decided it's worth the investment. I think there's real open questions about Afghanistan, about the governing capacity that's clearly a piece of this. And there's also real questions of how well you can succeed absent progress in Western Pakistan.
And isn't that where we should be focusing, Pakistan?
It's interesting. Pakistan's a country with 175 million people. It's the second most populous Muslim country in the world. It's got over 100 nuclear weapons. It's the headquarters for the most dangerous terrorist groups in the world. It's the sanctuary for the war in Afghanistan. It has tremendous impact over the future of India. Yet the level of U.S. effort in Pakistan is a tiny fraction of the level of U.S. effort in Afghanistan. It's not because the administration is strategically dumb. It's simply because Afghanistan is a place we can get involved and Pakistan isn't. And Pakistan, in a funny sort of way, won't let us because of the politics of Afghanistan. There's real limits on what the United States is allowed to do. And simply given the scale of Pakistan, there's a limit to what we can do inside the country. Pakistan's the toughest problem I know. That's nothing new. At my first meeting with Colin Powell when he was secretary, so this goes back to January 2001, at the end of an hour and a half, he said, "What's the problem that keeps you up most at night? What scares you the most?" And I said, "That's easy. It's Pakistan." And it was true then. It is now. And one of the things I've gleaned from my career is that we have a much clearer toolbook in foreign policy for dealing with your adversaries. We talked about the Irans, the North Koreas. We have the Cold War experience. We have almost a checklist: diplomacy, sanctions, military, this, that. Much harder to deal with your recalcitrant friends. How is it you persuade a Pakistan that's so deeply flawed politically, where you have a government not in control of the country, you have a government in some cases not in control of the entire government? Do you try to incentivize them? Do you try to at times threaten them? We've tried just about everything, and nothing has succeeded terribly well, yet the stakes are enormous. So yes, we're doing less in Pakistan than we are in Afghanistan, even though the stakes in Pakistan are larger. It's simply because we can't translate that into policy.
Finally, Middle East or Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian, you've been doing that for years. You did it with Jim Baker when you really wanted to push, and there was probably an opportunity to push then Israel. What's the opportunity now, and or is it just so messed up given the lack of leadership in the region?
I once wrote a study about ripeness, and the idea was certain things had to be in place, prerequisites, before there could be diplomatic breakthroughs. In the Middle East, the place where I see some potential ripeness is between Israel and Syria. And that I'm intrigued about. Syria is a government that is strong enough, if it wants to make peace, it could. For Israel, making peace with Syria does not involve many of the neuralgic theological issues.
You have to give up Jerusalem.
Things like that. You're dealing with strategic real estate. So I wouldn't be shocked if there was some progress between Israel and Syria, and the politics of Israel would allow.
And does that help a Palestinian solution or hurt?
I think the dynamics of the Palestinian are largely set, but I don't think it hurts. It weakens Iran a little bit. It might make the Palestinians more anxious that the train is leaving the station without them. But making progress on the Palestinian-Israeli front is so difficult right now. Israeli politics, this Israeli government won't allow for it. More important, Palestinian politics won't. The Palestinians who are inclined to make peace lack the capacity, and those who have the capacity to make peace lack the inclination. And as a result, I don't think George Mitchell has a lot to work with at the moment on that front.
Council on Foreign Relations just came out with a really good report on immigration. Jeb Bush, Matt McCloskey, I think it was.
Yes,
right?
sir.
Talking about a legal path, a path to legal citizenship for immigrants. Why is that an important foreign policy issue?
For several reasons. One is this, what we call foreign policy, is increasingly hard to discern from domestic policy, whether it's immigration or energy or climate change or homeland security. I don't know where domestic policy ends anymore and foreign policy begins. The state of the U.S. economy. We're doing meetings on healthcare at the Council on Foreign Relations now, because if you're dealing with American competitiveness, you've got to. So immigration, it affects the quality of our workforce. One of the things that we argue for in this report, and it gets lost in the debate about illegal immigration, is greater legal immigration. The reduction in legal immigration, the limits we put on, I believe have been a real problem, a self-inflicted problem for the American economy. The way we treat other people when they want to come into our country. If you go to the Middle East, after people get done complaining about Iran or Iraq or the Arab-Israeli situation, they complain about visiting the United States. And we're losing a generation of people there. Obviously, the implications for our relationship with Mexico are fundamental. So to me, immigration is very much, it's one of these hybrid issues. One of the programs we started a few years ago after I got to the council was this program for state and local officials. And we now brief governors and, again, state and local types. And again, their agendas look an awful lot like a classic foreign policy agenda. And governors do trade missions. And they've got, or you look at the New York City Police Department, the kind of stuff that Ray Kelly and Mike Bloomberg have to deal with and so forth. So increasingly, I think these stovepipes, foreign policy, domestic policy, they don't really comport with the real world anymore.
Let's open it up. Madeline, do you want to answer? Okay.
Madeline, by the way, we both work for Madeline. She's on both of our boards. So
she every now and then apologizes for going to a Council on Foreign Relations meeting. She says I'm not monogamous. I don't think, did you raise your hands, please? I'm sure there's some.
Anyone else out here who's not monogamous?
Yeah, right. How would you define success in Afghanistan?
Steve, it's a good question. To use Bob Gates's answer, it's not Valhalla. It's not a shining city on a hill. I don't believe it's got to be a textbook, because as goes Afghanistan, quite honestly, so goes Afghanistan. Afghanistan will not be a driver of events. Dave Petraeus, when he would talk about what he wanted to achieve in Iraq, used to talk about Iraq good enough. And I think it's the same thing for Afghanistan. It's Afghanistan good enough. So I don't believe we can turn it into sort of a greater Middle Eastern version of Britain or Sweden. But you'd want a place where terrorist groups could not operate with impunity or great freedom. It seems to me that's probably the minimal definition of success. After that, that to me would be the one level of success I would want to achieve. After that, I think you're into kind of gradations of it, if you will, in the idea of us not having the Taliban in control of large parts of the country. I would say that's success plus, not having a massive poppy crop, not having terrible human rights abuses. I would say all of those things are success plus. But I think success in a minimalist way is making sure that Afghanistan is not a launching pad.
What surprises me about your answer is you defined it in terms of what we would want in Afghanistan as opposed to our own national interests. Shouldn't we be defining when we send our troops overseas based on our own national interests, not what we might want over there?
But it is in our national interest that in a global world, what happens in other places directly affects our national interests. So if the reason we're doing this is not this is not, if you will, simply a humanitarian program, though that's a legitimate national interest. But it would be that Afghanistan, once again, can't be used as a launching pad for terrorist attacks against the United States or American interests. Now, to me, the reason it gets complicated is I think most of us might agree that we need to achieve that. The question is, what do we have to achieve in Afghanistan so Afghanistan is not a launching pad for terrorists against the United States and American interests. And I think that's where you enter into some judgment calls. But after that, you're into things that I would say are success plus. And then you have to ask yourself, you've got limited resources for America's involvement in the world. What are the opportunity costs if we get more involved there? What realistically can we accomplish there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Just shout it out, yeah.
Two questions. First, if we had not gone into Iraq, would we be facing, in your mind, the same issues as we are currently facing in Afghanistan and Pakistan? Second,
Let's just do one at a time. I won't remember it. When you say, if we
now you were asking me to remember the second one. Okay, go for it.
Write it down. We promise to get to it.
touche. When you say not going into Iraq, you mean in 2003 by...
Yeah.
Correct.
What you would have if the United States hadn't gone into Iraq, in my view, is, for all I know, Saddam Hussein would still be in power. That's quite possible. Now, we now know he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, so it's not clear we would have faced any particular threat there. I think the biggest question would be, if we hadn't gone in, how much tighter could the sanctions regime, which was quite honestly eroding at the time, could it have been made? I believe there were things the United States could and should have done to strengthen the sanctions regime. I believe there were some things the United States could and should have done to have weakened Saddam Hussein's control over the country. And the real question is, would we have done those things, and with what success? But in all candor, I can't tell you, I can't sit here and say that if we had followed my preferred course of action, we would have a democratic Iraq right now. For all I know, we wouldn't. What we simply would have done was avoided what I believe were the direct and indirect costs of what we did.
Yeah, but the focus of my question, still delaying my second point, is
1A.
Is what happened in light of the fact that our biggest problem, as you describe it, is Pakistan. Would we have the problems today in Afghanistan and Pakistan if we not gone into Iraq?
The short answer in Pakistan, I believe, is yes. I don't believe the dynamic in Iraq has materially affected the dynamic in Pakistan. And at the risk of alienating some people here, I also believe the situation in Afghanistan may well have been similar. The reason the United States did not do more in Afghanistan after 9/11, when people like me argued for it, that we should do more in Afghanistan then, was not because of Iraq. The administration was not hoarding its chestnuts for the war that many people wanted to have happen in Iraq. And the reason is, as you know from the way they fought the war, they did not think the war would be a terribly demanding exercise. So they did not rob or short Afghanistan because of Iraq. They shorted Afghanistan because of strategic pessimism about what any investment in Afghanistan would produce. It's where a lot of the critics, I believe, have been wrong, which is, and I argued for a much more ambitious policy. Actually, I argued for a policy in Afghanistan in 2001 that's not that dissimilar from the policy in Afghanistan we now have in 2009, and I thought there was then a window where it could have paid off. But I don't believe that Iraq really had an appreciable effect, certainly on Pakistan. If anything, the United States, after 9/11, got more involved in Pakistan, gave the Pakistanis over $10 billion worth of arms. The problem is we didn't condition it nearly enough, so most of the arms are strategically useless, and there was probably an extraordinary amount of corruption.
Yeah. And two.
Yeah. Number two, a little bit more provocative. In light of your observation that Iraq was a war of choice, and in light of what people take today as misleading rhetoric regarding why we were going in there, whether from numerous books, articles, etc., do you think that if, in light of all that, if Colin Powell, yourself, and others at the State Department had simply said, we're not doing this, we're resigning, we would have gone into Iraq?
Let me say two things. One is, I won't speak for Colin, I'll speak for myself. The reason I didn't resign over Iraq at the time is I did believe that the Iraqis had chemical and biological weapons. And while I thought the war was not only a war of choice, but was an ill-advised war of choice, I had other options I preferred. I didn't think it was outlandish or preposterous. I just thought it wasn't the optimal option. And the way I wrote about it in the book is I was 60-40 against it. Choose the numbers, 60-40, 70-30. You don't resign, in my view, over differences like that. You resign, in my view, when it's an issue of great magnitude, which Iraq surely was, but when it's a 90-10 call. If I had known then what I know now, that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, yes, I would have resigned. If I'd resigned then, it barely would have been a one-day story. If Colin Powell had resigned, I don't believe it necessarily would have derailed the policy. I think the president would have regretted his resignation, and I believe the president would have moved on. If Tony Blair had lost the vote of confidence in the House of Commons, I think the president would have expressed great regret over what had befallen his good friend Tony Blair, and he would have continued on the course that he had chosen.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, way in the back there, and then up, yeah.
You already commented on weapons of mass destruction and the role that belief played in your decision-making, and rumor has it that Secretary Powell, when presented with that information, there were no naysayers throughout the various elements of the intelligence, military, governmental establishment. Basically, everyone believed that report. Clearly, in light of the evidence which you've indicated is, we all know today that those weapons did not exist. It's obvious that our intelligence system is broken. How do we fix it, and how do we fix it to the point where we can engage in foreign policy on a intelligent and knowing way?
It's a big question. You can try to fix aspects of intelligence which deal with your ability to gather information. That gets into all sorts of technical issues or human sources and so forth. But what I came across in the writing of this book was that the biggest intelligence failures were either intellectual or organizational. Look at the first Iraq War. We missed, in some ways, the analysis. We monitored the buildup. I mean, capabilities are usually pretty easy, though in this case not always, to monitor. We obviously missed the intentions. So we had a false negative. We didn't think, the intelligence community didn't think, for the most part, he was going to make. Then they didn't think Saddam Hussein had much in the way of weapons of mass destruction the first time around. Another false negative. Turned out he had quite a bit, we learned in subsequent years. And then you come to the second Iraq War. People thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be a false positive. And people totally misread how the Iraqis would react to what became the aftermath, the messiness. And there, actually, the intelligence community was right. Just policymakers ignored them. Because policymakers had assumptions and preferences, and they tended to discard messages from the intelligence community that didn't fit their policy preferences. One of the lessons I come away with is the power of assumptions. If you think that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, every piece of information that comes into you, you see through that lens or that filter. So you see that dirt has been moved. Well, that must mean he's hiding something or relocating it. Well, sometimes dirt is just moved because dirt has been moved. Or you see trucks being driven around. They must be mobile laboratories. Well, no, not necessarily. So what was interesting to me was the power of groupthink, the power of assumptions. So it means intelligence organizations need to be much better at challenging themselves, identifying assumptions, red teaming, challenging themselves. You've got to bring in outsiders who have different views. I think administrations tend to get too isolated and tend not to bring in people who disagree. So it's not enough to reach out to academics if the only academics you reach out with are academics who will sing a certain song about how the Iraqis are likely to react to a Western military effort of the sort we did. But to me, the biggest single things are to be very wary of assumptions. One of the best books that I know about public policy, and it's actually an appropriate place to talk about it, is the book that Ernie May co-authored, Thinking in Time, the book that he did with Dick Neustadt about the use of history for decision makers. And it could be a great gift, but it can also get you in trouble. But one of the things you want to do is identify assumptions, ask yourself, what piece of my analysis, if it turns out to be wrong, would really lead me to very different conclusions and so forth. And so I think the intelligence community has lessons to learn, but also policymaking needs to guard itself better. And that's, again, where you fall back on more rigorous, more disciplined, more inclusive systems of decision-making.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We've been focusing on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq for the past... We've been focusing on Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan for the majority of this, but I'd like to turn your attention to Honduras and Cuba. And so a couple quick questions. One, regarding Honduras, do you believe the U.S. has taken the proper stance in defending Zayala? And as far as Cuba goes, do you believe we should lift the embargo and normalize trade relations with them as a bill is being pushed through the House currently?
Honduras is a really interesting case, where you had a government that was subverting the Constitution, clearly, and then there's a coup, which is subverting the Constitution, that gets rid of the government. And so let's be honest here, there's not a lot of good guys. So this is not, and then, it's funny, when I used to teach at the Kennedy School, I used to say, foreign policy is hard. This is a hard case, but I think in the long run, the administration is right to support procedures and principles. And the previous administration got into some, I think, hurt itself in Venezuela when there was an extra constitutional move against Chavez. And as much as I would have loved to have seen Chavez ousted from power, I believe that sort of opportunistic reaction we had in the long run boomeranged. And so as much as I hate that we support the restoration of the previous government, Honduras, to power, I would support it. But if I were to support it, I would make it very conditional. And that I would, so basically, if he is returned to power, it can't be with a blank check. It's got to be very conditional, with basically safeguards that he was trying to destroy before he was ousted. So if he comes back, I would not give him a blank check. And if for whatever reason he doesn't come back, that I would then have a very conditional approach towards the military and the people they put into place to get them out of power. So either way, I would have a very conditional approach. But by and large, I think the United States does better when it takes the longer, more principled approach. I think particularly in Latin America, where there's a neuralgia about us for historical reasons and all that, we've got to be very careful about being overly optimistic.
The long view. It's been 100 years or so since we have been supporting coups in Honduras, and it does come back to haunt us.
I think it does, by all things being equal. So I think, but again, but if he is restored, it ought to be in a heavily conditional way. With Cuba, yeah, I lean in the direction that a much more open policy makes sense. That the embargo, it seems to me, has limited our influence. It's allowed the regime to wrap itself in nationalism, to blame its failures on us. To me, the only real intellectual debate about Cuba policy is how step-by-step conditional we ought to go, saying we will relax sanctions if you do certain things politically, or how much we just ought to basically say we're going to relax sanctions because we think you won't be able to resist a more open relationship. And that to me is really the only serious debate. Because the current policy for all these years, I think every 50 years you ought to review a policy, whether it's it's the 50-year rule. And so since we've now reached that in Cuba, and to me the real question again is what you replace it with.
Yes, back there, right, gentlemen. Yes, sir. Yes.
You have to call them some women. You're sexist.
Sorry.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are about post-President Mubarak's position of power and what will happen to Egypt. And second, the growing development of Kurdistan being so independent and autonomous from the rest of Iraq. How do you foresee Iraq becoming unified again?
The first question was about President Mubarak and Egyptian political succession. The second is about the situation in northern Iraq. Let me take the second one first. I don't support Kurdish independence. I think it would trigger all sorts of violence within Iraq, between Iraq and Turkey, and so forth. What you obviously want is a considerable degree of autonomy. You've got it. If you go to Kurdistan now, it's quite successful. It's economically the most active part of Iraq. The problem right now in Iraq is the biggest fault line in Iraq is probably not Shia Sunni anymore. It's probably Kurdish Arab. So you can't, I don't believe talking about an independent Kurdistan would do anything but ignite a war between Iraq's Kurds and Iraq's Arabs, be they Shia or Sunni. So to me, the debate is over the formula for a unified Iraq, not over whether you have a unified Iraq. The question of Egypt, yeah, I worry a little bit about Egypt. I mean, Egypt is exciting economically, and the great energy of Egypt for the last few years has been economic reform. The most talented people are working on it. But Egypt's been a great disappointment when it comes to political reform. There virtually has been none. It's very top-heavy. The regime is tired. There's two principal contestants or protagonists, if you will, for succession. One's the president's son. The other is the chief of intelligence. Omar Suleiman is a very capable man. I just think that what worries me about Egypt is the concentration of political life at the top. It's you don't want to create a situation in Egypt where you only have a tired regime, an authoritarian regime, and the Muslim Brotherhood. You don't want to allow all that to become the choice, because one day I fear the choice would then become pro the Muslim Brotherhood, not because most Egyptians want to live in a society controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, but they will just want something new. They will want something different. And that's why I believe Egypt needs a more open political process, and the sooner that begins, whether it's under Mr. Mubarak or under his successor, whoever he will be, the better. Because it's a little bit like Iran before the revolution. You don't want to have polarized choices, and you don't want the mosque to become the only place where political discontent could get voiced. And I worry that Egypt is now an overly polarized society.
Right. I was trying to look for a woman, like you said, but nobody's
Right in the back.
Oh, okay. We are way in the back. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for being the voice of reason, Richard, over all these years. Thanks, Richard, for being the voice of reason after all these years. Given that China has spent their time and money in developing their infrastructure and buying natural resources all over the world, what is your concern that if we get divorced from them, they will tear up our credit card? And how much are you concerned, which would affect our foreign policy and engaging in all these wars, and how much are you concerned if they don't rip it up, that we will just self-implode because we're still running around thinking we have all this money?
Let me answer a few things. One is when I make a list of the things that concern me most about American foreign policy and in the 21st century as it's unfolding, the prospect of Sino-American conflict is not high on my list. It's not really even on my list. So I worry about a lot of things before that. And I believe the United States and China have, there's many forces that bring them together. At least as many, I think actually more, bring them to some extent, to use my favorite word, to integrate them, to encourage cooperation, so as anything else. So I don't see the 21st century unfolding the way of the 20th century, being a century dominated by great power rivalry, in this case between the existing great power, the United States, and the rising great power, China. I believe that forces of globalization work against that, and the fact that there's many common threats that the United States and China face, which is not to say we see everything the same. We obviously don't in important ways, but I still think the forces that what we have in common far outweighs what we have apart. The United States is obviously very dependent on China for our financing, but China is extraordinarily dependent on us for our markets. If you're China, your Achilles heel is unemployment, and you do not want to do anything that would jeopardize your ability to keep this enormous growth machine growing.
So they can't cut up our credit card.
No, in a sense you have a bit of a mutual hostage relationship, which is not to say it can go on forever. Herb Stein was right. that which can't go on forever won't. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. At some point, this degree of indebtedness could give the Chinese leverage. The Suez crisis is somewhat informative there about what happens about countries whose currencies become too dependent upon foreign financing.
Let me, because we're about to wrap up, just one last question. Is that Mo back there that I skipped over? Or, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Isaac. I just have one quick remark and a question. The remark about the weapons of mass destruction, we believe in Europe anyway, at least, that the administration here never gave the international inspectors time to finish their jobs. There is a clear intention to go to war, as you said, 9 months before, and the question of proof, etc., was not here or there. So I think that point should be made, that nobody found any weapons of mass destruction. The inspectors even searched Saddam's bedroom, and there was nothing. So that is a fact I think we should not forget. The question I have really, or the worry I have is, what is the role of the media? I mean, this is the greatest democracy in earth. What happened here after September 11? Somehow everybody wants to sleep, and there's a fear kind of overtaking the country, allowed people to make strange decisions. Congress, honorable members of Congress, renaming French fries as freedom fries because France. I mean, it's so ridiculous. How come a democracy as great as yours, all these institutions, suddenly succumb to this mass brainwashing as we believe happened here?
Yeah.
On the first point, let me just quickly say that Saddam Hussein was not in compliance. The purpose of the inspectors was not to prove, it wasn't the burden of proof was not on the inspectors to prove noncompliance. The burden of proof on the United Nations resolutions was for Saddam Hussein to demonstrate compliance. The inspectors could not inspect every garage, every truck, every factory in Iraq. And what the Iraqis refused to provide was the informational base, which they were obligated to. Now, we thought that meant Saddam was hiding weapons of mass destruction. What we subsequently learned is that he was hiding the fact that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but he was in noncompliance, and more time would not have changed that, in my view. The second question I think is fascinating. The second point is fascinating, which was, here I've written this book called War of Necessity, War of Choice, and the War of Necessity barely passed the American Congress and was extraordinarily controversial in the media and the public at large, whereas what I dubbed the War of Choice overwhelmingly passed the American Congress, and to the best of my knowledge, journalists were not writing articles saying this is a bad idea. Columnists were not writing columns saying this is a bad idea. Journalists were not saying, by the way, why there's no weapons of mass destruction. I actually believe, and I'm glad you raised it, this was a real failure of American democracy and a failure of American society. The administration failed within itself to produce decisions rigorously, to question assumptions. We talked about this before. But American society failed to. Congress failed. American media failed. The checks and balances of American society simply didn't work. And I think it had a lot to do with post-9/11 mentality. I also believe it had a lot to do with post-9/11 politics. There were not, shall we say, a lot of profiles and courage out there. It was the winds were blowing, and people were quite honestly worried about going against them. And I hope, as a society, we have taken something from that. That in this case, it was an extraordinarily expensive war, which I believe will have a lasting. No matter how well Iraq turns out, I believe that history will judge this an extraordinarily expensive war, both by what it cost directly, but also what it did for, how it led to the United States squandering, essentially, a rather unique moment in history where we really could have shaped an era of international relations. And I really believe it, history will judge it, not simply the principal defining failure, I'm sad to say, of the 43rd president, but I believe the responsibility goes broader, and it's to the failure of our independent institutions to act independently.
The book is War of Necessity, War of Choice, Bob.
Exactly. Well, I know we thank all of you. Richard and Walter, thanks very much. And Richard will be signing books in the back. And thank all of you for joining us tonight, both here at PEPCI and on the radio. Thanks very much. Good night.